Well, so I think we have a little while for really Kate and Dean and I to chat a little bit. The idea here was really for a couple different things. One is this, like I mentioned in the introduction, this is sort of the intellectual womb that helped to cultivate this collaboration. And so we just wanted to give a sense of how the three of us work together and how our minds and hearts have melded. So just to see this Zoom configuration with the three of us kind of warms my heart. But we're thinking about, for the three of us, really kind of finding what are the threads amongst those four presentations. And so I can go first in offering just a couple. The first one that always hits me is the courage, the true courage that these students have cultivated within themselves to voice and challenge the dominant hegemonic norms that are very much in the field of clinical psychology. They're in a place right now in which they, don't have a lot of status power as students. They're being evaluated. They're also looking at how to form themselves and ensure enduring livelihood, basically, as a clinical psychologist. And so when you have those things, those aspects there, think about then the possible fear of talking about coloniality, talking about socially conferred privilege, talking about history, and how that might impact adversely their trajectory in their career. And so we talk about the kind of negatives or challenges, if you will, around this decolonial work. And I am kind of in awe at how these students have had the courage to acknowledge that. In the lab, we talk about that explicitly. And yet they have this sort of incredible fire and motivation and insight to continue in this work. And then it's been really demonstrated today. So I just want to truly applaud all of the presenters today and say that for me, it gives me a sort of sustaining, generative energy that sustains me in this work. And I just want to say a huge thank you. The second thing I'll say here is the theme around connecting and integrating a historical context within your clinical work. I think the norm in our field is to have a type of historical amnesia and to think that there's really kind of a disconnect or we're somehow immune to the shared historical ground that we all share. And yes, the manifestations of that in each of us as individuals and in our different identity domains is different. But what is the same is really the shared historical ground with all of the wonderfulness of it and also all of the kind of blood and suffering of it. And so we see, I think, in all four of these presentations, a much deeper, richer understanding of contemporary issues once we contextualize it within that historical frame. And I think that is a real principle and clear intention that we have in our labs and in our curriculum is to make that connection, because I do believe it's going to manifest in a very different type of clinical outcome. So with that, hand it off to Kate.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Jude, that was a really empowering and important aspect of the theme that you're talking about, where everyone was able to contextualize it within the history of colonialism which is how we can understand it and understand where the problems are and critique and sort of improve. If we forget our history as a context to our research, then we're just sort of furthering the colonizing agenda. So I love that part, and it relates to one of my themes. So thinking about decolonizing research, that was one of my themes from my speech, and also something we talk a lot about in our groups. I already mentioned that Quinn and Hannah were doing emic research, and that really was the case for everybody. Everybody was talking about either all people of all races and all genders, or if they were talking about a specific group, were belonging to that group. The other sort of piece of it I think of is power with. I think Jude, Dean, and I create spaces in our labs where we can have these rich discussions with students, but on the same level. Like really, we don't try to lead the discussion. We're sort of like here asking questions, allowing questions, all of the types of things from group process on as much of an egalitarian landing as possible. And then the third sort of piece of the decolonizing research that's shown throughout was positionality and attending to their own positionality. And I think all of the students did a good job of that. And it's something we have to do, right? That's one of the things we're talking about with decolonizing research, is acknowledging the researchers' biases and assumptions and so forth as it comes from their positionality. It's empty advocacy without thinking about our own identities, as Jude says, which I really like. So I thought those were some things to do with decolonizing research. I would also say the dissemination of research and decolonizing that. So asking, Quinn and Hannah having take-home questions, Susanna's call for self-reflection before going through the styles, Jack and Cynthia calling for us to engage with their materials and websites outside of the presentation, the use of the breakout rooms. These are all our attempts to sort of make it more interactional, despite it still being a little bit didactic, but just trying to create interaction and celebrate your expertise as well as the audience. And my other theme, last but not least, is about relationships. And so I think that came through in different ways. Something I thought was particularly interesting was that Susanna's presentation, although being about individual styles, was all within the context of relationship and community and what that can look like and how we can interact in group processes based on our individual capacity and cognitive style. I also think in general, all of the presentations speak to the fact that these were all born out of relationship, and all of us in our research groups critiquing and asking questions and making suggestions and bringing our own histories into the room to be able to create and co-create research projects. Dean, how about you?
Well, thank you, Jude and Kate. I guess my first reflection is about some of my experience in social justice work over the years. There's a saying that the devil dances around things that are important. So the technological glitches of this symposium, I had a sense that there was a coloniality demon invading our space. And I'm trusting that we were able to rise above this malevolent energy. One of the main themes that I'm also struck by is that this is a multi-generational problem requiring a multi-generational effort and intervention. So we need to gear up for the long haul, actually much beyond our own mortality, that we're laying the seeds for future generations to carry the torch. In my breakout group, there was a comment, several comments, that the symposium is inspirational and we have a long way to go in terms of diversity at Antioch, especially Antioch, New England, which is by its population, mostly Caucasian. But in the admissions process, I think that the pool of application is widening to a much more diverse candidate pool, which is exciting. So I think we depend on each other, that the work is essentially impossible to do alone. So I want to just lift up the theme of collaboration, that this is really at the heart of decoloniality.
both in the way that it allows us to decolonize, because we need a group to do that and different perspectives. No one perspective can help with decolonizing anything. But also because having those relationships gives us that foundation of like healing on the inside, being able to have heart and warmth in the space that you're working on this is part of what helps us do it, because it is so debilitating, really. Pushing against a system that's built to not move is incredibly hard work. So the collaboration is both instrumental in achieving goals, but also instrumental in staying sane as social justice advocates.
Our themes of our discussions with the three of us then sort of bless and curse our labs and our students. And some of those themes I heard so distinctly in all four of the presentations. This idea of historical amnesia, malignant normality, and this real deep connection between basically colonial mindset and colonial strategy that still, perpetuates with us today. Through all four of them, I really thought about what if we were in this kind of historical amnesia, and we disconsciously agreed to not really connect the issue with history and colonial principles. How would it have been different? Because I think we kind of think about how this idea of decoloniality is sort of abstract and difficult to comprehend. But I think all of our presentations, all of the scholars today, the activist scholars today, embodied some of these step-by-step concrete things that we can all do. One, start with our own positionality. Start with their own identity domains that both have socially conferred power and privilege. Two, which is so essential, I think, is to exercise a type of compassion for all parts of ourselves, both the places where we have privilege and the places where we don't. And that's not to say that we are complacent to those places we do have privilege, but it's a place where we want to really honor our own style of decolonization and liberation of the parts of us, honor our own kind of wiring, if you will, and then really think about how we can support each other in relationship in that work. And then finally, when we think about any sort of clinical issue or societal issue, we dig into history, we dig into finding the roots. And I think that all of our presentations did those kind of concrete step-by-step pieces. And the result is, I would pose, very, very different than if they hadn't done that.
And I would highlight, in conjunction with what Jude has just shared, the need for self-compassion in the face of the swirling violence of our society. How do we bear the psychic pain that we see in the news of police brutality, the war in the Ukraine, and the killing of innocent civilians? So I think there's a discipline to become more and more aware and understanding, but how do we metabolize the awfulness of colonialism? And how do we rise above the pain so that we can really be witnesses of hope.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've had an ongoing discussion, the three of us, around the idea of hope and who is able to hope and where are you in your process of decolonizing yourself in terms of hope? Like, where are you in the process towards hope in terms of decolonizing yourself? And I'm not sure we really ever came to a conclusion. We talked about the idea that it has a lot of different sort of meanings to different people for different reasons and with different stages, as I mentioned, in identity. I also wanted to mention, sort of bringing this to the individual level of the therapist. This came up in one of the themes from the group, one of the groups. Actually, why don't I give you credit for group 3, about the idea of the coloniality of self-disclosure in psychotherapy. So this idea that by discouraging self-disclosure, we are encouraging more of a power disparity between the therapist and the client. And very much feminist therapy, as an example, we are, feminist therapists very much encourage self-disclosure from the therapist, and to the extent that I think they get kind of like a bad rap for it, when in fact it is with this idea of egalitarianism and mutual empathy and mutuality in general. So I think the idea there is, it also reminds me, by the way, of Yalom talking about fellow travelers. So by being in that sort of fellow traveler stance, that is helping to be power with rather than power over with our clients. And it's one way of sort of decolonizing the psychotherapy role. One thing I wanted to, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go again here, but Dean, I was thinking about you with one of the things that a group brought up as well. This is group 9, about collaboration, because we were just talking about that. And this idea of whether collaboration is a colonial or anti-colonial concept. And they came to the conclusion that it's probably dependent on context. But then when we think about collectivist societies, maybe they're more likely to be collaborative. So therefore, is individualism part of the cultural thing that gets in the way for us for collaboration in the US? Certainly there are times when collaborative spaces are not actually collaborative. Part of that is who's invited to the table. So who is allowed to collaborate on a different thing. And that reminds me of the points about participatory action research that came up in the presentation in my speech, where we're trying to invite those whose voices are not heard to the table when creating research as a way of decolonizing it. But yeah, I thought, Dean, you might find that relevant to what we were talking about with collaboration in terms of collectivism and individualism.
Well, I've been thinking about benevolence and malevolence. So collaboration on behalf of benevolence is for social justice and a peaceful world. Collaboration for malevolence perpetuates war and injustice and oppression. So I think a lot of the question behind the question is, what's the intention of the collaboration?
I also think of, and you can count on me to be the pessimist with not a lot of hope. And so I struggle with hope, the idea of hope. And I get concerned if hope is kind of code speak for bypassing difficult places and difficult pieces of work that we all need to do, reconciling our own socially conferred privilege, understanding that our history and our roots have been entangled in colonial efforts in some way. And then am I using hope as a way to bypass maybe grieving and the need for reparations and those sorts of things? The one thing I notice in this work over the 4 or 5 years that we've been together has been that there's a drive for us to kind of be drowned in the the amount and being inundated with the suffering, the human suffering that we all create for ourselves and each other. And then the sense of hopelessness. And then I notice a strong drive to ask someone else who looks like they have the answers. Well, what do we do? What do we do? Jump to this place of how do we fix it? And I notice the three of us in different ways responding to that question. And I wonder if that's a question for, that comes up for all of us as participants today, is listening to these presentations, kind of dipping in to the depth of suffering and oppression that's occurred, and then jumping to this place of, well, what do we do about it? But this alternative view of relationship, collaboration, and internalized compassion of our internal work, of taking a look at parts of ourselves that we want to start to decolonize, looking at our habitual thoughts and feelings and actions, and asking ourselves gently, how do these have colonial roots and influences that are probably in my bones in some way? And just that kind of gentle awareness of that, as well as noticing the parts of me that don't have socially conferred privilege, that have been oppressed or marginalized, and really also taking a look at how do we take steps to liberate those parts of ourselves. And I noticed that out of that more gentle personal work almost naturally flows and reveals the type of meaningful action that we can take. And I wonder if that impulse to look at what do we do to fix the problem, again, might be a way that we might be bypassing that internalized and relational work that needs to occur.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's been a good ongoing theme in our conversations, the three of us, of times and places in our roles at Antioch, being asked to provide resources, being asked to tell people, give people a checklist or a guide. And that the point really is that none of that matters if you're not doing the first step of the inner work and the forgiveness and the mourning and the repair and the healing and the relational work, as you mentioned. And it can actually get kind of frustrating at times. It's really, that's really important to start with the inner work. And I think that we have that instinct for a reason. We want to be able to take action, because not taking action is further traumatizing. It's a precondition of trauma to not take action. So it makes sense we have that urge. But that is an action to do the inner work and to do that reflective for life, ongoing work.